In the first session, we thought a lot about the conditions in which you're currently working with RTVS and some of the potential opportunities, but also some of the challenges that are just kind of built into the system as a handicap. The fact that you're connecting via screen a lot of the time, that there are challenges with verbal and non-verbal communication when you're transmitting within this tiny little box sometimes, that you're working with teams that often have challenges negotiating ownership and transitions of ownership and decision making, and a simultaneous need for lots of support and lots of stress, but also the very understandable challenge of feeling quite threatened if they're perceived as of a lower competency or lower position in the hierarchy, and sometimes feeling invaded by having an external team export their expertise and feel a little bit threatened by that as well. And that can be really difficult kind of thread to balance out. And so in particular, in the last session with Matt, we talked a lot about some of the things that we can do to mitigate that proactively. And one of the key things that we talked about is really thinking about the quality of your voice, and thinking about your body and your voice as instruments that you can manipulate with intention to help support creating a safe connection with people that you're supporting virtually. And so we talked a little bit about our pace and how intentionally slowing down, giving people moments of silence in a conversation during a retrieval call to express their thoughts and process what we're saying can actually be a useful diffusing technique to decrease the amount of stress that they're experiencing or we're experiencing in that moment, to get them to the point where we can more actively problem solve what's going on for them and their patient right now. We also talked about some strategies called transparent thinking, where we're putting what we're thinking very openly on the table so that other people can see it, identify it, and therefore not feel like they have to guess it. And that can again be a really containing, comforting moment for them. And also about the idea of shared vulnerability. So often one sort of technique that we can use to help people feel more comfortable is to share some of our own challenges or share a human part of ourselves to the point where they feel more comfortable and connected over the phone. So I'm just going to pause there and see if anyone who came to that session had any reflections, or if any of you who didn't would like any clarifications. I'm going to take that as a sense to keep going, but please feel free to put your hand up or jump in at any time you like if you'd like to add to the conversation. So we talked about the quality of your speech and your movements, and the way that even potentially when you are working on a retrieval call, you do have some space on your screen, if you're using video calls at least, to harness and use your body language to create a supportive environment and supportive movements that can make people feel comfortable and safe. So some of the techniques we talked about is making meaningful eye contact. And I think what's really interesting to me about eye contact in a virtual setting is it's an illusion, right? Like we're not actually making eye contact. And so but what can happen though is that if we're looking in the wrong direction like this, it can certainly send a clear signal of a lack of eye contact. And that can be perceived as either minimization or a lack of being taken seriously, at least at a subconscious level. And so actually making the intentional choice that even when you've got lots of things that you're having to look at on your screen, particularly in moments of stress or in moments where you are wanting to make a meaningful connection to the clinician on the other end of the phone, making deliberate supportive eye contact can be really useful. And actually one interesting technique I'd heard from a professional storyteller, she has a little sticker on the top of her, a little arrow sticker on the top of her camera. And when there's a particular moment in her story that she wants to generate real impact, she'll actually look directly at the camera. And I think for me, I certainly noticed when she was telling those stories that had a very different, subtle hit as the storyteller when she was trying to make that deliberate connection, even though it's an illusion. We're not actually looking at each other right now. Yeah. I'll move on, but that was the idea. So the first things we're thinking about the quality of our speech and our movement and how we can reflect on that. And I think it's important to recognize that we will all have our own techniques, style, mannerisms that we want to recognize and understand, but that taking that next step back and thinking about watching ourselves on video sometimes, and identifying what are the ticks, what are the things that we're doing that potentially are misread or are value add for the type of connection that we're trying to make people from across the screen. I feel like I'm lumping you with a lot of verbal information there, so I just want to give that some time to sit and just check in again. Dana, you have your hand up.
Thank you so much for taking the time for that refresher encapsulation. And one of the things that I also really took away and I've really been thinking about in this work is the idea of the distributed memory like that. And I'm wondering if you can, maybe for those who did not have a chance to be at our last session, so I think that was a really important point, especially when we think about the bidirectional learning and not extracting, just coming in and kind of being the expert. So I wonder if you might speak about that a little bit. That really
Yeah,
struck home.
absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Dana, because it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I could talk about that for a very long time. To give people a little bit of a recap, I had presented before our communication workshop a talk on a concept called transactive memory systems. And transactive memory systems is an idea from the social sciences where it was recognized that humans who work together in teams or systems essentially distribute their knowledge and memory between each other, and that none of us can know everything there is to know in healthcare. Instead, what we have to do to form an effective system that can provide the most care to most people within that service is to distribute that knowledge between us. And so that idea was first popularized about 20 years ago by a gentleman who was researching relationships in long-term married couples. And when they were interrogating and investigating how married couples stored memory, what they would notice is that different types of memories were stored in different parts of that married couple. So to draw on a fairly stereotypical example, one that's certainly accurate for my family, my mum is very much the emotional center of our family. She connects all of the grandkids and children together that she has, and she has an intimate memory of the developmental milestone of every child and grandchild that she's raised, and what time they started walking, what were their first words, when their birthday is, etc. And so if we're in a family setting and we're trying to remember when that happened, we're not going to ask my dad, right? My dad is not going to be the source of that information just based on his personal interests and expertise. We're going to ask mum, and she essentially holds that knowledge for the family in some ways, in that we know that we can draw from that person's expertise in moments where we can't recollect it ourselves. And similarly, if we want to know the Wi-Fi password for mum and dad's house, we're not going to be asking mum. In fact, if I do ask mum what the Wi-Fi password is, she literally, if dad's not there, will call dad and just pass me the phone. She won't even try and answer that question because she recognizes that's just not her domain of knowledge that she holds within this family subset. And so when this was tested 20 years ago, essentially one of the interesting things that were found was that the couples who were questioned individually about particular memories were less accurate than the couples who were asked to recall it together. And that when they were recalling information together, they actually had a strategy where they recognized implicitly who stored what piece of knowledge, where that was stored, and they could help steer each other to a more accurate memory together than when either of them were questioned separately. And I think this is a really critical concept to get our head around in healthcare, partly because I think it's a call for humility. And I think every component of the healthcare system holds different parts of that knowledge, whether we're working in social work, whether we're the enrolled nurse or the ward staff who know where equipment are during a resuscitation, whether we're the endocrine team and we store intimate knowledge of the pancreas and other organs, whether we're the cardiac team and we store knowledge of the heart, whether we're the retrieval service and we coordinate the knowledge of how to move patients safely between sites, who has what expertise at what area, rather than what is the exact thing that needs to be done in this particular situation. And so often, a lot of the time, I think there becomes a heavy disconnect in healthcare because we forget that. And we have to forget that to some level because we've got too many other things to remember within our own specialty. But we can start to judge others based on what they know of our bucket of knowledge, rather than recognizing that they have a completely different skill set and set of knowledge that means that they are adapted to perform their task in their part of the healthcare system. And so I think a lot of the role, particularly for RTVS, is you've got a particularly beautiful role within that service of not necessarily containing all of the knowledge to help resuscitate every patient that you provide advice on, but instead the ability to connect all of those neurons together within the health system to find the right piece of knowledge and the right person to help each patient and help them optimize their care wherever they are throughout the region. And it sounded like that sat with you, Dana.
Yeah, I just really appreciate right now your connection to humility with that, right? I just think that that's if that's what we can lead with in our TVS is that humility. I think we're so far ahead of the game. So thank you for that connection too.
Thank you so much. Matt, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, and just to spin that further, I mean, there's so many details and nuances in all of the tiny communities that we serve, from resources to transport, even our regional centers. Like, there's no way that one person can know all of those details. And so that's why it's so key, from us, from a transactive memory as a group, to really rely on, the nurse, the leader on call, our transport advisor, the EPOS physician, a receiving physician. Like, there's so many nuances to this that, to think that you can do it, based on your own sort of knowledge, I think is completely lacking in humility, Dana. So I think we need to just recognize that piece and understand that everyone has a huge role in the team. So that's me as well with that piece.
100%. And I think, being able to recognize that humility for ourselves, but also the admiration for others, in that sometimes it can be easy to judge, particularly for staff who maybe you're connecting with in tertiary large centers, on what is the standard of knowledge for a particular clinician. And being able to recognize that actually a clinician who works in a regionally isolated place makes a huge amount of other sacrifices to their professional development opportunities, to their ability to be exposed to a variety of conditions, that mean that they actually take a personal knowledge hit in order to be capable of providing the service in a location that it's needed. And so I think, being able to step back and just value every clinician for where they are, what they're taking to provide care in that place, and what they bring, can be a really helpful foundational stone to build a relationship that's mutually respectful and valuable and safe. Any other thoughts before I move us on? No? Great. So just continuing with our recap. So we've talked about the quality of our speech, our body language, and the ways we can adapt that, be mindful of that when we're connecting with others. And the second thing that we started talking about was proactive strategies to do with the content of our speech. And so we talked about some things that are pretty simple when you think about it, but often we maybe don't do intentionally or with discipline, that can be valuable proactive strategies for building relationships over virtual forms of communication. So those were simple things like building in very specific and deliberate introductions. So for example, in one of the hospitals that I work with, in Queensland Children's Hospital, the biggest change that happened in our medical emergency team, or our code blue responses in the hospital, was when the person who was leading the service implemented training that insisted that the first thing you did when you arrived at a code blue was to introduce yourself and ask, how can I help? And what we found was that made an enormous difference to how that team was received, because previously what they were opening with was, why did you call a code? And that is a completely valid, completely understandable thing to ask in that moment, because you've come from, maybe a busy ICU setting. There's something wrong with the patient, presumably, and you're wanting to find out what that motivation was. But the way it was sitting and being heard by staff on the ward was really coming through with a very pejorative lens, and it was setting off immediately a ripple of defensiveness that could become really difficult to unpack later down during a busy resuscitation. So I think really being comfortable doing those simple things like introductions, being deliberately and explicitly using appreciative and validating words like, thank you so much. I think you're doing a great job there so far. I'm wondering how we can best help, or how we can just optimize this resuscitation a little bit better based on some of our thoughts. Dana's got a lovely comment there about when you shared how nervous you felt when you were shown the layout and delivery suite. Did you want to unpack that at all?
Sure.
Labor and delivery suite.
I mean, I can tell the quick vignette. I was doing a locum, in a place, and you could feel there was like a bit of tension, and we were introducing Rudy, and there was a bit of pushback, kind of subtly from the group about like expectations, of care if they don't call RTVS. Does that expose them to criticism for level of care or all the rest of this stuff? And I could just feel this like weird tension, and I was trying to get where it's at, and it's like, really, it's like no expectations, we're just here to help. And I relayed the story, like I was doing a locum in a small place, and they were showing me around, and they showed me like the labor and delivery suite, and like immediately like my sphincter tightened and my blood pressure went up, and I was like, oh man, like if I have to deliver a baby here, like I'm calling Mabel like in a heartbeat. And all of a sudden, like the tone in the room just changed, right? It was like, we all have strengths and weaknesses. Like that's my humility, and I'm saying like, yeah, like it's okay to call someone for help. Like you don't have to try it and like fake it till you make it. Like I would, it's way outside of my scope of comfort. Like technically in my scope of practice, yes, but man, like the tone totally changed. Like in the room in terms of like a bit of a shared model of how this whole thing plays out.
And I think just to break down what you did there's a couple of really nice techniques that you've used at once. But Elizabeth Malloy has published work on this, where she called this intellectual streaking, or intellectual candor. And so the idea there is essentially, she wrote it about being an educator, but the idea that you would share that vulnerability as a proactive strategy early on within an experience can both humanize you as a facilitator, but also it immediately makes it permissible to say that you don't know something, or say that there would be a ceiling of your comfort, which is different from your scope of practice. And it can be really easy to underestimate the sheer built-in handicap we have when we're brought in as consulting or advising teams from a socio-evaluative stress kind of component. We bring a lot that even it doesn't reflect who we are as people or our own values, but it just is built into the system and the historical hierarchies of medicine that make us feel like there needs to be shame about not knowing what can't be known, and shame about potentially not having capacity to do everything. And so I think naming that early as a facilitator sounds like it was a real release for your team as well. So thank you for demonstrating that. So we talked about a couple other techniques, so specifically invitational moments. And I think particularly when I'm coaching senior clinicians or consultants, or I think what you'd call attendings, we often find that they're very good at leading a team actively, but they're quite often quite poor at inserting moments of silence or pauses or invitational moments within their recaps. And that can have an unintended consequence. So they'll often do a beautiful recap in the middle of a resuscitation, summarize what's going on with the patient, summarize what the plan is, and then share what they want to happen in a certain amount of time. And what they often rarely do is ask for critique, to ask for value add or suggestions of ways we can do things better. because I think we often think as senior clinicians that if we are nice, people will just offer those moments spontaneously. And there's been a fair amount of research that suggests that actually they won't. And so actually just taking the moment and carving out moments throughout your call where you're touching base, checking in, and exploring from the team's perspective if there's anything that you might not be aware of that's shaping the advice that you're giving, or making it harder to integrate or act on the advice that's being given, or things that they can see that could make this plan even better, can be really valuable. And I think investing in that time, in those time limited calls, can be really important. We also talked about transparent thinking. I won't relay that too much any further, but essentially the idea that one thing that can be really reassuring for teams is the ability for you as a senior clinician or a senior advisor to just be sharing and narrating what's going through your head. It can be incredibly powerful. We spend a lot of time guessing and trying to read other people, and the simple act of making that really, really explicit can be remarkably containing. So that might be saying things like, I'm worried about this patient too, but I think we can work together to get the best outcome we can here. Or, I'd honestly love to get to you sooner, but actually at the moment I've got this resource and this resource. So while I'm really valuing what you're thinking about this patient and I accept your level of concern, I'm trying to triage 3 different situations at the moment, and I'm wondering how I can work through to make sure I get the best outcome for all of them. So just being that explicit and open can sometimes not be super instinctive. Any thoughts on that? All right. Well, I'll keep chugging away, but now that was basically the recap of what we'd covered in the last session. And so I'm wondering now, what I'd love to do is move away a little bit from the proactive strategies that we've talked about, and maybe talk a little bit more about the reactive strategies, or strategies that we need to be able to pull out in different moments in time to manage some of the more potentially heated or challenging conversations that you experience when you're providing advice. And so I notice at the moment people are pretty quiet. They're worried about, I don't know what's going through your head, but I'm a bit worried we've emphasized maximizing time for the session, but I'd really be interested in hearing from the group on what are the strategies or what are the challenges that you have within your retrieval calls, sort of more at this pointy end of the spectrum where things can get a little bit more conflicted or challenging.
I'll take a go. Hi, Ben. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian, and I've been helping sort of build this program for a few years now. And one of the most interesting situations that we've had over and over again is when nurses call Rudy when the doctor doesn't want them to. That's always a fun one. It's hard to master that one. I mean, it really comes down to the nurses not trusting the doc, which has got heated, as you can imagine. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer to that one other than just being kind and using all our kindness and compassion. That's certainly been some of the stickiest Rudy calls I've ever had, where there was really debate about whether you should be called at all. Like something that was mentioned at the beginning, like the second you call a virtual support, like the minute you have virtual support as an option, does that obligate like a higher standard of care, right? Like if you didn't know before and you had no one to call, then it was okay not to know. And now if you don't know and there's someone to call, then the obligation is now that you should be able to figure it out with help someone else, right? Like that, like you mentioned. So I've certainly, that's been some of the most uncomfortable Rudy calls I've ever had. I don't know if there's a good answer to it, but I'd be curious to know what the brain hive thinks about that one, or how to de-escalate that one, or how to provide good advice to someone that doesn't want it, but it's sort of forced to get it for good reason usually.
And that sounds really challenging. Can I clarify a couple of things that were challenging in that moment? Was, so one, you had a potentially sick patient, but that there was a difference in signal or level of concern between nurse and medical staff. Is that right?
100%. Yeah. So
Yeah.
like the nurses called Rudy because they didn't trust the doc was what it boiled down to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes, I guess we talk about trust, but it can also be that they actually had valid concerns and needed an escalation pathway to raise them, right? Yeah. And then that must land you in a particularly tight spot where you are breaking the bad news to the medical clinician that the nurse has concerns that they have raised to you and not them? How do,
Yeah, I mean that's a way to look at it. I think like
mm,
why the hell did you call Rudy was the last one that I heard the doctor say. I
mm,
think you're doing fine. Well, you're clearly not doing fine.
mhm,
Uh, Arthur, I see your hand up. Arthur's been doing ICU for a few decades.
This is specifically about Charlie call, actually, Rod. We talked about this at one of our Charlie meetings about a year or two ago, and one of our providers got a call from a nurse in a similar setting. So it was a patient who was an inpatient under rotating GPs who were covering call for inpatients in
mm,
the hospital. The GP got called, gave some advice over the phone, and then one of the nurses called Charlie for a consult and said that the patient was admitted to hospital under an MRP, but they wanted a Charlie opinion on it. And the provider did the right thing and said to the calling nurse, well, I can't really give you a consult if the patient's already got an MRP unless we get the MRP on the phone and we do the consult together. Do you want to do that? Right? And I think that was the appropriate way to do it, right? Because if you've already got an MRP who's already expressed an opinion on the issue that was being called about, then I think the MRP or the doc who'd been acting as the MRP needs to know that there's concern in the hospital setting about the consultation that's been given. And secondly, the nurse needs to know that Charlie can't really consult on a patient without involving the MRP. And that's the way I'd go. And that way, everything's out in the open. And if everyone's prepared to, you can have a talk about it. If everyone's not prepared to talk about it, then it could become problematic.
it sounds like that's a really tricky needle to thread. And I love what you've done there, where essentially rather than playing into the dynamics that could be a little risky, actually moving the whole team forward to a better place where everyone is aware of the data and is able to make a shared decision rather than either just directing them back on their own and not engaging or supporting them. Because I guess I can imagine one of the tricks certainly I see in my clinical practice would be a not unreasonable solution sometimes for nursing staff who are in a situation where they have high levels of concern that isn't being heard, is they need to phone a friend to get that extra level of support because the local hierarchy isn't making that possible. And you kind of want to encourage that, but you don't want to destroy the relationship with that people either. And I think taking the step to redirect the whole team back to communicating as a whole can be really powerful. I remember once I had a text from a registrar I hadn't worked with for 3 years who was, in high levels of distress about a patient that she was convinced had meningitis on the ward that she'd been told not to do a lumbar puncture on. But then she was sort of asking me in another town with no skin in the game what to do. And so we did sort of encourage her to just relay and give her permission to talk to the senior clinician. And that was all the senior clinician needed. And I think often the time, sometimes reframing their level of concern as being really valuable data that doctor would want to know about rather than something that needs to be concealed because they've said something that's in conflict can be useful. Tricky stuff. Just reading your comment, Dana. I think this might speak to the culture of not asking for help that exists in medical culture. I agree. And I think that's really intergenerationally embedded now to the point where we have to come up with systems and sometimes overtune our behaviors to make them more approachable and invitational because people really struggle with this at baseline. I know I certainly did as a trainee. Great.
If you put it in the light of for the good of the patient, right? So you involve everyone who's expressing concern about the patient and say, okay, so let's try and resolve this in the interests of best patient outcome. And then nobody can get off.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple nice key phrases that I heard recently as well that can sometimes be diffusing and validating. So one was from someone who'd studied ergonomics actually, and she said, "Look, we know statistically that nursing concern is a statistical predictor of patient deterioration." And so being able, if someone's calling, if a nurse is calling with concern and that's being either minimized or not heard or seen as a threat, like being able to just label that as data and say, look, we know this is an independent predictor of patient concern. So I think that's valuable data still. So I'm wondering how we can integrate that level of concern with the clinician's assessment on the floor and make sure we've optimized this patient's care as best we can based on the systems and tools and team that we've got. So some pretty nice spicy challenges already. Thanks so much for sharing. Are there any other challenges that you find, particularly when it comes to conflict between teams or challenges negotiating with either receiving hospitals or referring ones? Cool.
I didn't want to jump ahead because I see that Matt and Gord have hands up, but I don't know if
Yeah, I'm so sorry. What I've realized just now is that the hands on my screen aren't, if you've got limited cameras, the gallery wasn't triaging them. So I'm so sorry I hadn't seen. But yeah, Sarah, please jump in.
No, that's okay. All I was going to say was, when I first joined this RTVS movement, the thing that really has always echoed in my mind is John saying, we're trying to shift from why are you calling me to how can I help you? And I'm just chuckling that some of these challenges are a new version of that same problem. It's not why are you calling me? It's why did you call them? And so the culture still exists in the places that need our support. And it's just shifted away from us towards the people calling, towards the people who are reaching out for help. And so probably some of the solutions lie in the same things that we've been sort of baking into the foundation of how we're trying to be in these spaces.
Yeah, 100%. It's an interesting meta problem, isn't it? That you've clearly become safe enough for one group of people, maybe not safe enough with a different subset in some settings as well, and whether there needs to be deliberate work with a subgroup of that, or whether that's just related to the hierarchies that are so deeply embedded that we need long-term work in medical culture in general. Yeah. How about you, Gord?
I almost hesitate to bring up this, but it's not so much a conflict that's occurred with, hospitals or practitioners, but probably one of the most upsetting interactions was more with a patient. And I think we often struggle to try to do our best for the patient, but sometimes the patient gets in their own way. And without going into specifics of the patient's details, it was very clear from a clinical perspective that by following what the patient wanted would in fact end up doing harm. But the patient, again, lived in a rural and remote area and was Indigenous. And here I am, the, privileged white man kind of trying to help. And then as soon as I guess it became clear, although I was doing my best to help, that they were not going to get their way with regard to what they wanted or they perceived the right medical outcome was. Then that kind of cultural part of it kind of got thrown at me, and I wasn't quite sure how to deal with it. And it was, as I said, I'm sure my pulse rate's gone up even to discussing this, but all I could do is continue to paraphrase and use some of those techniques. Like, I understand what you're saying, and this is why I'm making this decision. And I feel upset that you feel that I'm not here to help you, and I'm hearing you, and so on. But it went nowhere, to the point where the patient then got up, yelled at the nurse, and left, and kind of left us both. It was worse than some of our resuscitations. We chatted a little bit about it, more to make, I think, ourselves feel better. But I wonder if you have any and I'm sure there's others that might have had similar situations that are that charged, whether it's based on culture or other features. I'm wondering if there's another way to kind of deal with that, or you have some techniques that would help. And I would presume that the fact that I'm still upset by this situation, it's probably 8 months ago now, that that's probably a natural response. But I'd be curious as to what others and yourself think.
I think the first thing that goes through my head is just the sheer like volume of cultural, biological systems issues that you're having to juggle at once and filter, triage, and balance in all of these phone conversations and support conversations that your team has. And it's just such an immensely admirable but complex task that I just take my hat off to you to be able to do it at all, let alone when it's that challenging. And I think to me, we might, I'm glad you raised that. I think there are some techniques that we're going to talk about today that might help somewhat, but I also think it's important that we free ourselves from feeling like if we're a master communicator, we can get out of any situation where two human beings have such deeply different value judgments about what's important, what they want, and sometimes they can't be fully resolved without conflict, and that doesn't, that we can maybe sit with that and accept it at some level, that there is going to be that small level of outliers where we can't always solve every problem despite using every technique under the sun, because our values and the way we see the world are just so different. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad in either way, but just it can be really, really tricky. But I think there are some things that we can potentially help. I don't know if others have comments before we jump in. Matt, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I might just sort of play complimentary on that for a moment. And sometimes, for me, it's understanding that other person's frame. Like where are they coming from in terms of like why are they behaving or thinking that way? Whether it's, I had a note in the chat there, whether it's a practice-ready assessment graduate who's come from another culture that maybe they're not calling because they're going to feel scrutinized by an external physician, and they're trying to maintain a standard of bar, or they train in a different culture where you had to be independent, right? Or in Gord's case, trying to gently probe a little bit about what led to that desire to that person feeling they need to go out. Like, what was the history there, or like what's the piece? Like trying to get at the the reasoning behind the behavior, as opposed to just the behavior itself and having a difference of opinions, versus trying to get a bit of understanding and therefore perspective.
I think that's lovely, Matt. Absolutely. I think there are some techniques that can help, and one that in particular we might explore today a little bit is naming the dynamic, which I might use that as a segue for us to just jump onto. So I guess what I've heard so far from the team is, you're balancing really complex things at time critical moments with limited resources in faraway places, and that can be an immense privilege, but also an immense challenge. And so there's two concepts that I wanted to focus on today to think about. One is relational coordination theory, and the other is a technique called naming the dynamic. And I find both of those really, really useful in different situations. And the theory of each of those is relatively straightforward, but the what's the right word? The practice of it, the execution of it is often where the challenge is. So we're going to just explore those theories a little bit. And then Matt, Melissa, and myself are going to role play a slightly tense phone call and try out some of those techniques and see how they land. And we're then going to debrief that, talk about how that played out for you guys as an audience and for us as participants, and then have a little bit of a breakout group just to hopefully get the chance for a few of you to just try out some of those techniques, or if you're not feeling comfortable trying them out and role playing, just chatting through those techniques in a smaller group where you might be able to sort of tease out where the barriers are or the things that really sit well with you are. So we might start with relational coordination. Is anyone familiar with relational coordination theory at baseline? I'm doing a quick scan of the Zoom screens, can't see heaps of nods. So that's great. So relational coordination theory is really, really interesting. It was developed by a lady called Jodi Gittell. And what's interesting about it is that, I don't know about you, but ad nauseum in simulation settings and in critical care settings, I feel like we are constantly told about how we should be more like airlines and pilots, and engaging with safety systems the way that airlines do, and how well they do and how poorly we do in healthcare. And what's interesting about that for me is that there are lots of great learnings that we can take from the airline industry with regards to the ways we communicate, but some of it really doesn't translate well at all, because the analogy is actually very different in that, airplane takeoff and landings do involve a fairly predictable and finite number of variables. They can be cancelled. So you can certainly cancel taking off if things are too unsafe. And a lot of the time in healthcare, we are dealing with such an infinitely larger amount of variables and complexities that some of the analogies just don't really work, even though it would be great if we were as safe and as systematized as the airline industry sometimes is. And so what Jodi Gittell's theory actually switches us to is she actually looks not at airlines, but at airports. And if we think about hospital systems, actually they have a huge number of similarities with airports, and a lot more than they probably do with airplanes themselves. And then if you think about an airport that's running in a large and busy place, you have a huge number of people coming in every day that need to be triaged, taken and stewarded to the right areas through security, through check-in, get some food, get through potentially passport and immigration control, and then onwards to the correct plane with their luggage most of the time. And I think that the sheer fact that that does actually happen most of the time is kind of a miracle when you think about the number of sub-teams within that service that actually need to integrate and interact at different points in that client journey to get to the right location. And so Jodi Gittell spent a lot of time analyzing, doing qualitative analysis, and watching different airports, and airports that were flagged as high performing, high quality airports with good ratings and high efficiency and safety ratings, and others that were doing poorly. And she came up with 3 key components of high performing teams who interact well in that kind of complex airport system. And those things were, 1, shared knowledge. So the knowledge, as we mentioned before, was distributed safely between teams, but it was also communicated. The key points were effectively synthesized and connected to the right sub-teams within that environment. Secondly, there were shared goals. So there was a shared vision for what needed to happen for every customer who came through the airport, and that was shared as a collective within all of the teams within the airport, even though some of them never met face to face. Like if you think of the baggage crews compared to the check-in crews, they actually don't interface face to face very often. And then the last one was having a shared vision and mutual respect, and that was key. So in high-performing airports, the teams where the security team trusted the check-in team and had respect for the airlines themselves, etc., were more likely to both perform well, and critically, they are more likely to adapt to the uncertain. And so when there were situations that were unique or unpredicted, the fact that they had that ability to have shared knowledge, shared goals, and mutual respect meant that they were able to adapt more effectively to the unknown and problem solve in the moment to make sure that things went well for more customers more of the time than places where that didn't happen. And so I think those are useful pillars for us to think about how we approach our retrieval calls, partly because they're philosophical and we think that we can think strategically about ways that we can share our knowledge, ways that we can share our goals and establish mutual respect. But it can be also sometimes a useful kind of criteria for me to think about when I'm in a problematic or challenging call about what are the things that I can try and establish verbally to actually get us back to being a high performing team on the same page at the same time. And so this is really subtle but important for us to think about, because we can often think that we have the same goal, right? Because superficially, we all want the right thing to happen for the patient. We want patients to get best care, have good outcomes. It's consistent with their values and cultural needs, and that should be sort of established at baseline. But actually, as human beings, a lot of the time, our goals are much more complex than that, often sometimes self-serving or survival-based, particularly when we're working in overloaded systems. So if I'm referring to a surgeon, a patient who I think probably doesn't have appendicitis, but might, that surgical trainee is balancing a number of different needs that are unnamed versus the ones that can be named. So they may well be filtering what's right for that patient, but they're also filtering, what's my boss going to think of me if I accept an unnecessary transfer that takes up another bed and then didn't need our service in the first place? I'm going to get slammed, or I'm going to get criticized on the ward round. I've got 3 other patients that are really sick right now, and my priority is actually them and not this one, right? And so being aware that sometimes our goals, or at least the ones that we're not sharing, aren't always the same, can be a really important thing for us to be able to establish, so that we can then re-identify and realign explicitly as a team what our task is. So if I gave you a scenario from my clinical workplace, I know this is not completely generalizable, but if I'm in pediatric trauma resuscitation and I've got the surgeon saying we need to go to CT, and I've got ICU saying no, we should just be going straight to theatre, then both of those goals are kind of valuable and understanding, but they're in conflict with each other. And if things are getting tense, for example, then one of the things I might say is, it sounds like everyone in this room really cares about this patient, really wants the best thing to happen for them, but we've got very different ideas about what that is and what that looks like. And so I'm wondering if we can just name that at the moment and work out what our key priorities are for this patient and how we can safely guide them towards best outcome. And so just taking that moment to explicitly put that as a little bit of a boundary, but also to sort of harness what are our actual goals at the moment. Because the goal isn't to get to CT or get to theatre. The goal is to stabilize the patient and have a good outcome. And if we can realign them with that, we can start problem solving how the best way to achieve that is. I'm just noticing a couple of comments from Dana. The number of times I would have loved to cancel the trauma case or resuscitation. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So that's relational coordination theory in a nutshell. It's the idea of how do we establish a shared understanding of what's going on and what our knowledge is, and who holds what piece of expertise that can help, and what our shared goals and vision is for the patient, and also establishing mutual respect. So taking moments within a retrieval call where there are tensions to validate and appreciate every single contributor within that team, even when there is tension, I think can be effective in diffusing. Scott, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say, in terms of shared goals or unspoken goals, in my world, and I suspect this is consistent for a lot of us, one of the unspoken goals that interferes with transfer and retrieval calls a lot of the time is fatigue and workload. And it's very, very common for me to have a difficult time getting a patient transferred when the patient's going to arrive in the middle of the night on the other end, and the person clearly doesn't want to deal with it. It's a lot easier if they're going to arrive during daytime hours. And it strikes me that that's a tricky one, because that's a hard goal to identify out loud, and also not something that most people would admit to. Most people would say, we want to do what's best for the patient, but it really commonly, I think, interferes with our transfer. And I'd just be interested, how do you deal with something like that when someone's doing the deflection karate to keep from accepting the patient, mainly because it's related to fatigue and or workload or availability of service in their hospital.
Yeah, I think that's such a valid and important thing to raise, because the reality is our quality of care in most hospitals decreases at nighttime, right? We make an intentional design decision at some of our systems to drop the resourcing based on frequency of patient presentation, and we tolerate a different level of risk for patients at nighttime to maintain safe staffing during the day, to make our work lives human enough that people will actually do the jobs that are important to be done, because they're not completely slammed by night shifts all of the time. But there is a definite patient hit to that, right? And so I can imagine you would have to, certainly for myself, we see that a lot, where the standard of care or the conversations we're having and the attitudes we face are very different based on whether it's at a time of day where that's an easy to achieve thing, or whether it's at nighttime and actually that's a lot of extra workload on a smaller group. In terms of specific tips, if that's what you're looking for, like, I think again that is something that you can sometimes name. So actually, we're going to explore the other technique, which is called naming the dynamic. So I might introduce that as a concept now. So naming the dynamic is essentially calling out the elephant in the room, or naming a dynamic between a particular group of people that's happening live in a moment. And essentially the argument is that when there's an elephant in the room, it gets a lot of its power from being unspoken. And so I think a lot of power that we can bring as essentially facilitators, as you are, or connectors between different services, is the ability to positively frame but actively name things that often aren't named in healthcare, in ways that can help us start to problem solve the situation by actually owning and acknowledging that it exists. There is risk to that. So a lot of people are very averse of naming the dynamic, particularly in heated conversations, because they're worried that it's like pouring petrol onto a fire and it's just going to make everything worse. I challenge that from experience, but I think it has to be done carefully. So I think absolutely, if we just say, well, I think you don't want to take this patient because it's nighttime, and if I called you during the day, then you would have taken them, no worries, and that kind of pisses me off right now because I think it's in the patient's best interest, then absolutely that would just be fundamentally inflammatory and damaging thing to do. But I think if we can name the dynamic in somewhat neutral or positive ways, then sometimes it can still be helpful. So for myself, I might say something, if I'm having a disagreement about a retrieval with a receiving team, then I might say something like, look, I guess what's challenging for me right now is, based on this patient's collection of symptoms and our level of concern, during daylight hours, I think the process would be very different to the process that's currently being advised. And I guess my concern is, I don't think the time of day that we're currently working in should change this patient's outcome. And I'm wondering how we can overcome the resource limitations we've got at the moment to find a solution that meets this patient's needs. And so sometimes that can mean we can still name something, but we're not like slamming people or blaming people, but we're going, look, I know it's harder at nighttime. Like, this is a real legitimate challenge. We've got less resources. There's like one night reg on, but I'm still really concerned about this patient. And I think we have to find a way to make this work. And I'm concerned at the moment that this isn't the safest plan with the resources we've got available. John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great conversation. I just wanted to share one of the special attributes of the RTVS team that I think is fundamental, and it's a focus we've had from the beginning, is that of advocacy. And so as providers are connecting with other providers on the ground with really challenging patients and situations for various reasons, it's just about 5 o'clock in Takla, the sun's going down, no one's getting out of that community, somebody comes in right now, the people on the ground know that no help's coming for a long time, and that's just knowing that puts everybody's blood pressure up. And so you don't sleep as well. There's a lot of things that run through your veins, but one thing we've done very well, or all of you have done very well, is the advocacy part. And there's nothing that builds trust and relationship in the moment than advocating for the people on the ground. And a lot of the conversations that you were just sharing are actually executed by our RTVS dogs. So they're the ones who are making those calls and advocating with transport and the retrieval teams to please come, or this patient needs to go to a higher level. And when people on the ground see somebody in the moment advocating for them and their patient, the feeling you get, because I have that lived experience for a long time, you in the moment, you build such an instant bond with that person who's doing that advocacy for you. There's nothing like it. And so I just reflecting back on how important the advocacy part is. And the other part I would say about one more story that was triggered in some of the earlier thoughts was around early in the RTVS work on a Rudy call. There was in one of our communities, there was a code call in a very small hospital with one doc, one nurse. And while the doc who was asleep at 3 a.m. and was trying to rouse themselves with this code that was being called, the Rudy doc was actually running the code virtually with the nurses on the ground. And when the doc on the ground came to the bedside, there was a new dynamic that had never played out before, where the Rudy doc was kind of the team lead, so to speak, with this resuscitation, and the doc on the ground kind of just fell into the whole scenario of following suit with the nurses, and they worked as a high functioning team in kind of a very spontaneous way. And that would never have happened because normally the doc on the ground is everything. They're trying to manage the airway, run the code, remember the drugs, do CPR and all these things. And so when we went to the community and debriefed, the doc really shared how, I mean, this just happened. It wasn't scripted, but how that in the moment scenario where the virtual doc assumed the lead of the resuscitation worked so very well. And they shared how when you're at the bedside and you're trying to do all those things, you lose perspective very easily. And of course, we all know that when we're in these small places, we don't see somebody's not doing CPR. We can't see that the oxygen's pulled out of the wall, the IV's out, all these things that happen. So I'm just sharing that part as well about that the virtual creation. It's actually the hybridization of a high functioning team in really small places, like Dr. Dana shared. It's so important, and how people show up in those tough scenarios. The advocacy part is so tremendously important. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And I think there's, a couple of things that struck out for me were both, the in the moment support and advocacy that the team were getting. But I can imagine as well, like when those positive experiences do happen, that really builds some nice longitudinal psychological safety for those teams as well, who know that there is someone looking out for them, someone to support. And it, I can imagine it just takes a little bit of the edge off a lot of night shifts as well. If that there is a team who can help lead, who can help support you, it's just immensely valuable long term for the culture that you're working with. So thanks so much for sharing. So I'm wondering, Matt.
And Ben, can I just underline one thing that is really striking home that I think is important for us? Like, because when you talk about advocacy, I think often I think of advocacy as sometimes getting a bit adversarial, for the benefit of the patient. And what really strikes me is that your advocacy there was not damaging of the relationship, and it wasn't demeaning to the person, and advocacy didn't have to become adversarial with that transparency technique that you chose. So I think that that's a really big take home for me, actually, in the advocacy work I often do.
Thanks so much for highlighting. All right, so I'm wondering if we switch gears now. So we've talked a little bit about relational coordination and setting shared goals, shared vision, and mutual respect. And we've talked very briefly about naming the dynamic and how that can sometimes be useful, but we've got to be careful. So we want to use it in ways that are still productive rather than destructive. And so our plan from now is we're going to do a little bit of a role play, if that's okay with Melissa and Matt. And so what we wanted to do, Melissa's kindly written a scenario, and we wanted, it's always tricky when you're writing scenarios to generate conflict, to demonstrate conflict resolution, because it's really important to us to not also negatively stereotype or portray other services. So, but we have tried to make something that's authentic enough that gives us an opportunity to demonstrate some of these techniques, but I certainly don't want it to be seen as us portraying a particular subgroup or a tertiary receiving as a particularly obstructive or challenging group, but we did certainly need some meat for us to bite into and discuss. So to give you a little bit of a scene, and Matt and Melissa, correct me if I've got any of the details wrong, but we're going to be imagining that Matt, again, is, as per last time, is, he's a pretty calm, organized clinician, and he's got a pediatric trauma victim that he's trying to advocate for retrieval and transfer for. And then Melissa is going to be a transport physician from BC Children's who's negotiating a number of challenges and is less enthusiastic about receiving the patient. And we're going to let the situation get a little bit spicy and tense, specifically because we wanted to demonstrate some of the techniques we might use at the pointier end of the spectrum rather than representing anyone. And so if you just want to have a watch, have a think, see if any of these, we haven't rehearsed it, so we'll see how it plays out, and see what technique you find useful from each of the three role players for how they negotiate this conflict, and what might be useful in your own practice. So we might start. Are you happy to start, Matt, with the phone call?
Yeah, I can start, Ben, and I may sort of start just telling you the case as the Charlie doc, and then we might have like Melissa sort of pop in kind of partway through, and then I can kind of rehash, and then which is kind of how it usually goes, if that's if that's all right. Do you want people to turn videos off, or do you want to just sort of keep it as is?
Yeah, that's okay. That might just be clear, and I think that will just highlight the three videos on the screen when it's a good. And so I'll be role-playing a Charlie physician in this context, trying to add some pediatric resuscitation tips and also sort of negotiate where this patient should go. But yeah, if people could just turn off their video briefly so that it will just highlight the role play for us.
All right. Hey, Ben, thanks so much for taking my call here. It's Matt Petrie. I'm just working in Williams Lake here. I've got a unfortunate 8-year-old Indigenous male who's involved in a multi-passenger MVC. It was a head-on car collision at highway speed. I have 2 other victims, another child and a critically injured adult patient as well. My local pediatrician is a locum from Delta, not really trauma comfortable, but is dealing with a less injured child. So my patient's basically kind of semi-stable en route here. Heart rate's 138. O2 sat's 95% on a non-rebreather. BP is currently 105 on 66. Rest for 25 with a GCS of 14. Moving all extremities, belly's tender. Definitely have like a bit of stripe of free fluid, so I'm suspicious of an intra-abdominal injury there. Has some notable lacerations to the face, zygoma. Got a bunch of peripheral ecchymosis. It's definitely like a boggy, I don't know if it's a true boggy hematoma, but there's definitely some notable head and face trauma. Right side of the chest has significant ecchymosis. Some crepitus tender, definitely looks like a pneumothorax on bedside ultrasound to me. We got some lab work cooking at the moment. Got extra. They're probably just wheeling the X-ray machine in shortly. I've given an initial bolus of just 10 per kilo of saline, and kind of that's where I'm at right now. I've actually put a call into like PTN to get them transported. So they may probably jump on here shortly because I think they should probably get out of here ASAP just from a resource standpoint.
Sure. Okay, so thanks so much for giving us a call. And I'm going to just really quickly recap, and I just want to check in on how I can best help at the moment. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is you're juggling a number of cases. You clearly got a decent level of trauma experience, and in particular, you're worried about the 8-year-old in this multi-person MVA. There's 2 others with some injuries, but this fella sounds like he's got a tender belly with a potential serious intra-abdominal or internal bleeding, and also a right-sided pneumothorax, you think, and some signs of potential intracranial head injury as well. And you're keen to get them transported to BC, and you've started activating that process already. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, if you have any sort of additional kind of management, ideas, I guess. I mean, we may get him the CAT scanner here. I haven't put a. I mean, I'm comfortable with chest tubes, but I don't do a lot of pediatric, chest tubes. So I may even have to get called out to see this other patient. So I might even ask you to take over a bit of like observation of this patient while we're waiting. But I may even need you to sort of help negotiate getting this person out because I may not have time to sit and talk on the phone for a long time here because I got a pretty limited
Yeah,
time.
100%. It sounds like you got a lot on your plate. Now, in terms of trauma advice, I guess, I mean, it sounds like you're doing a good job. You've got your bloods up, you got 2 points of IV access. I don't want to tell you how to do your job. It sounds like you're doing a great thing, but just working through systemically together. From a hemodynamic stability point of view, where do you think they're at the moment?
Like they're definitely tachycardic. I mean, blood pressure is sort of in the range. I mean, it's a kid, so I mean, some of that may be pain, but certainly concern maybe sort of an early shock scenario. I think that'll probably unfold here in the next little bit, but.
And GCS 14, and in terms of, so I guess you got 2 points of IV access, started, crystalloid restrictive fluid resuscitation, which I think is sensible. Do you have access to blood if you need to?
We do. We have 4 units of blood, but no other factors in Williams, like just RBCs only. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess with the tachycardia and kids, dropping their blood pressure late, I think if you've got any clinical gestalt that's telling you this kid's shocked or they've got delayed cap refill, I would feel comfortable resuscitating with blood earlier rather than continuing saline if you've got the capacity within your service. Absolutely think, I mean, I do think they need a CT, and I guess the question is going to be whether we try and get as much imaging as we can locally, depending on your resources, or whether some of that needs to be done retrievally in BC. So I'm wondering if we might patch in Melissa now, if that's okay. So
yeah, I
she's
was going to say,
from
yeah, just came
BC
through
transport
here.
physician.
Hi,
Yeah, great.
this is
Thanks so much
Melissa
for joining us,
I'm
Melissa.
the transport physician on. How can I help you guys?
Oh, hey, Melissa. Matt Petrie calling here from Williams Lake. I've got Ben Symon on the phone with Charlie. I was just giving us some details. In short, I have an 8-year-old Indigenous male in a multi-victim MBC restrained passenger. At this point, in short, looks basically heart rate's 125. His blood pressure is like 105 on 66, satting 95% on rebreather. GCS 14. He's got some notable injuries to his like right periorbital, zygoma, like temporal region, and he's moving all 4 limbs. Abdomen is tender. It looks to me like he's got a trace of free fluid on bedside ultrasound. He's got notable ecchymosis and crepitus to the right side of his chest with a seatbelt sign. On bedside ultrasound, I also think he has a pneumo that correlates to that. Pelvis is stable. Oh, I think I forgot to tell you, Ben, he's also looks like he's got a angulated kind of mid tib fracture on the right. Sorry, I forgot to mention that before. We're just getting some labs going. We've got bilateral kind of IV access. We're giving him 10 per kilo of normal saline. We're going to group and screen him. But I think again, given the time of day and the resources here, like my local pediatrician is not well, not local, they're locum actually, not comfortable with sick kids. They're seeing a less injured child. I have a pretty sick adult that I probably need to attend to as well. So I think from a resource standpoint, this kid needs to go to children's kind of ASAP.
Okay. That I just don't think we have much information on this kid yet. Like it sounds like they just got there. You mentioned you think he's tachycardic. Have you given him anything for pain yet?
Yeah, I mean, I've asked the nurses to get some initial fentanyl going for this kid.
Okay.
Literally, we're just sort of doing like a primary survey, secondary survey, but I mean, I hear you on that, but definitely, I think we need to recognize maybe an early shock as well. So.
Okay. I mean, you've only got 10 per kilo in so far, so let's give some more fluids, and then if we can get type and screened, that would be great. I'm going to need some time to look at the labs and the X-ray once they're up and pushed to the grid. I'm not sure this kid needs to come to Children's, and it's certainly so early on. I wonder about transporting him to Kamloops. They're a level 1 trauma center. This kid is hemodynamically stable right now, and we just don't have more information on them.
I hear you saying like Kamloops is 3.5 hours by road, definitely to get there. I asked them to ask about our heart team. They're 3 hours out as well, and so they'd have to go by physician transport, which I don't really have. Like, we're pretty short staffed, so I have some concerns about both like the timing, of getting that person there, and I don't want to stay in play here too long with this kid. I'm afraid he's going to get sicker sooner rather than later.
Okay. I guess we only have one bed in our PICU right now. And I don't know for sure that here is the right place. Why don't we get some more information? Let's do a pan CT. Let's get the x-rays. Let's get some labs, give him some more fluids, and maybe give me a call back.
I wonder if I can
Yeah.
just chime in there, if that's okay. Is that all right, Matt, if I just
Yeah.
add some perspective, I guess? Can I paraphrase what I'm hearing from you, Melissa, at the moment? It sounds like you're juggling some fairly tight resourcing, and you're keen to have more information about the status of the patient regarding particularly the pan CT before making a decision about retrieval. Would that be fair to say? And particularly getting some bloods back. I guess if I can play devil's advocate here for a little bit, there's a couple of things that I'm trying to balance here that are in tension. So one of the challenges we've got here is, the goal to recognize early shock and mobilize this patient to a safe place to prevent further deterioration versus not overloading your system with unnecessary patients. And I think both of those concerns are really quite valid right now. I think one thing that's sticking out for me at the moment from Matt's perspective is he's juggling a resuscitation with multiple other patients with extremely limited staff. And this is the one that you're kind of most concerned about at the moment, but there's definitely worries with other resources as well. So I feel like there's some tension here. There's definitely some things that we can do to optimize this resuscitation, but I'd kind of echo the concern there that probably a 3.5 hour drive isn't going to be a particularly safe management plan if this kid deteriorates at all. But I can also hear that it's pretty important for us to get a little bit of information. I'm just wondering, as a collective, our goals here probably, from my perspective, would be to keep this patient safe with ongoing hemodynamic support and active resuscitation, making sure that we can get as much information as we can to make informed decision-making about how to transport him safely. But I am also aware, Matt, I can imagine you've got a lot on your plate at the moment that might limit our capacity to get more information in a time before this patient deteriorates and we get resources to you. Is that fair to say?
Totally. I mean, I got this other sick patient. I mean, plus even just the spool up time to get things rolling, from an air transport standpoint, like I would prefer to get that at least sussed out and rolling while we're doing the rest of this, as opposed to do things in series, from a time perspective.
Yeah. I mean, my gut, Melissa, it would be that this kid's got, multiple injuries, tib-fib fracture, there's ecchymosis of the skull that suggests at least some significant intracranial or cranial pathology, plus the intra-abdominal suspected bleeding. But I also hear that it is important for us to get enough information that we can do that safely. My gut would be that a CT, particularly CT pan scan, would actually add a lot of value add, even if the retrieval team arrives and it's been done. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. I think so. So that's added a lot of perspective for me. What I'm hearing is, and I wasn't aware of this, to go by ground from Williams Lake to Kamloops is going to be 3.5 hours, which is probably too much given what you're now describing to me. So maybe we could get ITT on the route there, and then by the time they arrive, sort out a final destination based on the information we have at that time, whether it's to us or to a different site. Does that fit better?
I mean, I think that totally makes sense to me. That means we've got more information for the team that arrives, but we're not spending time waiting for that information because we can see that this kid clearly needs, transport to a level 1 trauma center, wherever that may be. So my gut would be absolutely, let's proceed with a CT pan scan if you have capacity, Matt. Resuscitate with blood in the meantime and escalate earlier if we're finding that his condition deteriorates further, but that those things would still be valuable. And I'd argue a CT is reasonably quick for us to be able to do in most settings. I'm not sure about yours, Matt, at the moment in Williams Lake. Great.
And
so
we can get the rolling. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, so if I can just recap that, so I've got it in my head. Our goal is to just resuscitate this kid and keep him hemodynamically stable, to get him to an appropriate level 1 trauma center, wherever that may be. And that one of the things that is going to help us make informed decision is getting those blood back, getting the CT pan scan, and working out whether we need to do any time critical other interventions based on the data that brings us. So would that make sense? A plan moving forward, if you're happy to facilitate that, Matt? I'll stay on the line so that if you need me to take over team leading one of the resuscitations, I can still be available, and that should free you up. Melissa, is there any other concerns for you, Melissa, that we haven't addressed yet or that don't fit with you?
No, that sounds good. I think it's really important for me to know the injuries. I think there's a lot of suspected injuries based on Matt's exam, but really objectifying that is going to help me feel confident in which location this child is going to.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so Melissa, thank you so much for your advice and expertise. And Matt, thank you so much for looking after this patient on the ground in the moment. I'll just continue to stay on the line. I'm wondering if we could free you up, Melissa, and we'll call you back if you're happy to activate the team to start heading down.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. All right. Pause the
And
scenario
then
there.
yeah, let's do it.
Oh, what were you going to say, Matt?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna help wrap it up, but I think we're wrapped. I like it.
Sorry. Great. Well, we might start to, I'm just looking at the time, and once again, I've talked too much, lost the chance for breakout groups. I feel like with the 10 minutes we've got left, it might be worth us just talking through that, how that sat, and opening the floor up for reactions. So how was that for you, Matt and Melissa?
I was expecting more interruptions for non-essential information during my presentation, based on my experience.
I didn't play my script quite as well as I was supposed to. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Whoa. So what was the patient's blood pressure at the scene? Okay. So is their immunization status up to date? Yeah, which is like the usual like nitpicky. No offense, Arthur. But
yeah, I think
it's usually the fellow,
totally
not you.
I apologize for that. I also didn't want to come off as too brash either, to not over role play patients, but that was very much a real situation that happens.
You forgot to ask about the blood gas.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what the dog's name was, and
and this is tricky, right? Because when you're being handed the risk and you're being asked to make the final decision, it is very human to want as much information as possible, right? Yeah. I think Melissa's inherent niceness was definitely there. I still think there's value in the principles of sort of the way we might negotiate and come to a shared agreement was still there, though. So from the rest of the team, anything that feedback you'd give us on, or techniques that you've found useful that you might integrate? Ashnor.
Yeah, great job. I think if you guys need a second career, acting might be something you want to look into, but that was super helpful. But then I really appreciated how our collective goal is this technique, like watching that in action, because I could almost see Melissa, from your role playing, like, we don't have time for this, we don't have space for this, we don't have, and then the collective goal of like, we're trying to keep this kid alive, we're trying to make sure this kid doesn't deteriorate. And you could kind of see, I think, all of us being like, oh yeah, actually that is the collective goal, and really helping to kind of lower the temperature, I think. Because I think when you were sharing it initially, I was like, man, that kind of sounds like textbooky. How is that going to come out? But like watching it in the role play situation, because oftentimes, like for example, my brother's an emerge doc, and sometimes we'll have an argument and he'll start fifing me. And I'm like, yo, bro, like I know exactly what you're doing. Don't do it. You're irritating me, and so I kind of was holding on to that as you were speaking. So watching it in this kind of scenario was like super helpful. So thank you for that.
Oh, great. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for sharing. Anne-Marie.
Yeah, very realistic, very helpful. I come from a background, I'm a newer RTVS Rudy physician. I come from a background where we're just trying to access PTN. And, if it's a child under a certain age, we get maybe prompted to the channel of the PICU on-call pediatric resuscitationist. So it's what's really interesting for me is to know that there is the Charlie resource, and then actually then when you're the emergency, you're just the the armpit scratching emerge doc, one below the orthopedic surgeon. That there is there's a kind of a third person. For me, what I'm learning is if I'm concerned about a kid, I get the Charlie doc on. We still call PTN. We still get ported into BCCH. And then, to me, the frank conversations that work are, sometimes I'm like, can you open the map? Can I just show you where I am? Matt did a great job. Doesn't matter. They don't have to look at the map. It's like, I've done this in the Northwest Territories. If this child deteriorates and I'm concerned about shock, the best case scenario is that they're going to go by road to Kamloops. And that's a long time for a kid who's going to deteriorate quickly. So it's just really nice to know that that the resources are there to back up what I'd call the advocacy program. And I thought Matt was really diplomatic. Sometimes I've said, I don't know if you understand where I am, but here's the situation. And I actually described the transport patterns because I've worked in lots of different places, but then also having, like, hopefully all the other Charlie docs are good at delineating a plan of like what's best for this patient, given the resources, and then understanding that this person at the receiving end has limited resources. And then I guess I have one question. It's not, we don't have the time to get into a philosophical discussion about equal access to healthcare, but all of these situations to me bring that up. What's like, obviously we're looking after the client patient in front of us, but I don't know, has anybody ever said, I need you to understand the conditions of this situation, and this child or client deserves to have the same level of care in a triage system as all the other comers. So yeah, that's always a bit on my mind.
It looks like, Scott, you've got thoughts?
Just a quick comment to follow up with what Anne-Marie just said. I have literally had a neurosurgeon say to me, that person chose to live in that community, so they have to be prepared to accept a different level of care or something. Like, it wasn't even that friendly. It was like, they have to deal with the hand they're dealt.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
And sorry if I could just chime back in. I work in these communities because I really like these hardy people, and whether we can say they have equal access to healthcare or not. But for me, that's a big advocacy piece. And we don't like the answers always that we get, but we're still trying, which is great.
And I think what you mentioned about making the clinician aware of the resources you have, I think, that's really important data for that clinician to have. And if they're working in a situation where they're just pre-contemplative and unaware of that, that could very well be, seen as really helpful rather than impertinent or destructive to that relationship building. And I think I can imagine that having Charlie and RTVS to advocate for that is a really important part of their role. But Matt, I see your hand up. I can imagine you've got more accurate thoughts.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, like one of the ways that I think you address that in part of the conversation is really relying on facts, facts and expectations of care, regardless of scenario at the end of the day, as opposed to like opinions or all the rest of that piece. And I was just going to throw in like more sort of thing. If we'd run into trouble in that scenario, I probably would have looked for more allyship. Like I would have called the trauma team leader in Kamloops, right? Because that's who'd be accepting that patient. If they say no, they need to go to Children's, then that helps that port, or the EPOS physician, which is another transport physician that's in there. So, getting all the minds sort of in the table if someone's acting as an outlier, to that piece. But I think you named the dynamic, I think, in a really sort of clear and objective fashion, like without like this getting into the interpersonal nature of it.
Great, thanks. John.
Yeah, great case and great work, Matt, Melissa, and I have, it was done really well. The one thing I'll just stress from years of virtual support, and everybody knows this, but I just can't stress how important it is that the connection before content, and the little thing like just saying, oh, that's a tough case, Matt. And are you doing okay? And just humanizing and acknowledging that you're in a tough spot, and I recognize that, and I got you, that kind of thing. And it only takes a few seconds, and it's so easy to dive into the nitty gritty and start get into the weeds of it. But just starting out with just that human, acknowledging where that person is and the team is, and that they're in a really tough spot, and are they doing okay? So, and you came back to that, Ben, you did a brilliant job at the end. You kind of closed the loop on that, I thought, really well, and it just kind of humanized it again. But just that humanity and the help is so crucial when these kind of conversations go on, and there are multiple levels of conversations.
Thanks so much for highlighting. And yeah, I think the point you make about, it doesn't actually take a huge amount of time investment to build a large amount of rapport. It's just a few words that are authentic and heard by the other party can make a big difference to how much you're connecting and willing to go out for each other. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Anne-Marie, I can see you've still got your hand up. I'm not sure whether that was previous or whether you have more thoughts. Great. Well, just to quickly synthesize today. So thank you so much. I feel so honored and privileged to be able to come and connect with your team and see all the amazing work that you're doing. In particular, from a curricular standpoint today, we had a quick recap of some of the ways we can proactively use our voice, our body language, and the content of our speech to rapidly try and build rapport and diffuse a situation. And then we explored some of the more reactive techniques that we might use in that moment when things are getting a little bit more heated, and in particular thinking about naming the dynamic as a technique to defuse a situation and realign a team towards more common purpose, and the principles of relational coordination, of that shared values, shared vision, and mutual respect. And that potentially, if we can integrate that in the moment in ways that are authentic and not textbooky, then hopefully we can make a difference to the conversations we're having and help facilitate the connections with the teams that we're building. So thank you so much.